On the evening of February 11th, 1862, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant convenes a council of war with his generals, nearly all of whom endorse his strategy for an overland assault on Fort Donelson. The sole dissenting voice is Brigadier General John A. McLernan, who expresses reservations regarding the plan. The following day, Grant's expeditionary force commences its movement from the recently captured Fort Henry, advancing eastward toward Fort Donelson. Simultaneously, Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote directs his western flotilla into the Cumberland River to initiate a naval bombardment of the Confederate stronghold. However, unlike Fort Henry, Fort Donelson is expected to present a formidable challenge for the Union forces. On the morning of February 12th, the Union columns begin their march along the Ridge and Telegraph roads, benefiting from mild weather and rapidly drying terrain. Brigadier Generals McLernan and Smith lead their troops, while Brigadier General Lew Wallace remains behind with 2,500 men to secure the federal base at Fort Henry. The route to Fort Donelson in the adjacent town of Dover is characterized by steep hills and deep ravines. Yet the atmosphere during the march is one of cheerfulness, resembling a picturesque war in the South. Soldiers discard their unnecessary overcoats and blankets. The Confederates do not appear to hinder the Union troops' progress. As Grant's forces advance overland, Foote and his gunboats are simultaneously escorting troop transports carrying reinforcements up the Cumberland River. The USS Carondelet leads the waterborne column, tasked with signaling its arrival to Grant by firing several shells at Fort Donelson. By the evening of February 12th, Grant's land forces have reached the outskirts of the Confederate positions surrounding Dover with little opposition. However, General McLernan's cavalry patrols encounter resistance approximately 1 mile from the rebel defenses, as troops led by the rugged yet relatively unknown Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest establish a roadblock. The arrival of Union infantry promptly drives the gray-clad cavalry back within the Confederate perimeter. Recalling Pelow's incompetence during the Mexican War, Grant had confidently asserted that he would advance to Fort Donelson without opposition. At that moment, the Tennessee politician turned general was absent, having traveled to Cumberland City to persuade Brigadier General John B. Floyd to maintain a stronghold at the fort. He had, however, entrusted Brigadier General Simon B. Buckner with command and instructed him to avoid engaging in a direct battle. Buckner complied, allowing the Union besiegers to approach with relative ease. Gradually, General Smith and McLernan positioned themselves to execute Grant's strategy, which involved surrounding the fort and awaiting the arrival of Foote and his gunboats to replicate their swift victory at Fort Henry. In Grant's estimation, the Union Navy could force the Confederates into submission, thereby conserving both time and lives. As the Army commander and his staff established their headquarters at Widow Crisp's cabin on a slope along the eastern bank of Hickman Creek, situated behind Smith's line, the sudden crackle of musket fire pierced the otherwise tranquil winter evening, signaling the initial engagement between the two forces. The stage was further set when the USS Carondelet briefly signaled the presence of the Union Navy on the Cumberland River. Gradually, Smith's troops advanced up a ridge toward the rifle pits occupied by Buckner's division nearest to the fort, while McLernan's forces began to march to the right to reach the river above the town. As darkness enveloped Fort Donelson and with incomplete information regarding the situation, Grant's army settled in to wait for daylight to finalize their encirclement of the Confederate troops. That night, the Federals gazed across the ravines at the flickering campfires of the Confederate encampment beyond the earthworks. The Southerners found themselves cornered against the Cumberland River, with their escape routes rapidly diminishing. The Confederates had come to this location prepared for battle rather than retreat. At the river, Lieutenant Colonel Milton Haynes keeps his water battery gunners engaged, primarily to bolster morale in anticipation of the feared Yankee gunboats the following day. On the river, 2 remaining steamboats, still in Confederate service transport, Floyd's Virginians from Cumberland City, illuminated by flaming torches and greeted by cheers from the shore. When General Floyd arrives at dawn on Thursday, February 13th, he establishes his headquarters in a charming hotel in Dover, situated near the upper steamboat landing, to evaluate the circumstances. The first day of combat at the Battle of Fort Donelson, February 13th, is characterized by 2 intense infantry assaults and a naval bombardment. This day serves as a measure of Confederate strength and fortifications, though it does not escalate into a full-scale battle. All three engagements commence in the morning and persist into the afternoon, accompanied by the persistent crackle of sharpshooter fire and sporadic artillery explosions. General Smith and McLernan are tasked with demonstrating their presence without launching an attack on the enemy, yet they promptly disregard these directives from Grant. The Army commander has also ordered Commander Henry Walk and the USS Carondelet to conduct a diversionary bombardment of the fort, facilitating the land forces in completing their encirclement. Walk faces intense fire from Haynes's water battery gunners, achieving little in the way of results. But as the colloquial expression of the time suggests, the engagement has commenced. Ultimately, the primary land confrontations capture the Federals' attention, as they reveal that the investment of Fort Donelson may prove more challenging than initially expected. The initial skirmish on February 13th begins on the front of Brigadier General C.F. Smith, as the 2nd Division attempts to advance closer to General Buckner's position along the Eddyville Road sector. Lacking reliable maps, Smith instructs Battery D of the 1st Missouri Artillery to bombard the Confederate defenses in order to reveal their battery positions. Following a substantial breakfast, the elderly brigadier commands a coordinated advance of Colonel John Cook's 3rd Brigade and Colonel Jacob G. Lallman's 4th Brigade. The eager Northern troops march forth in battle formation, contravening General Grant's directive to avoid initiating a significant engagement. The Southern defenders, entrenched and prepared, unleash a fierce barrage that disrupts Smith's advance. By late afternoon, Lallman and Cook managed to withdraw their forces after a fierce skirmish, leaving nearly 100 fallen comrades on the hillside before Buckner's fortifications. The excitement of their first battle is overshadowed for both sides by the grim realities of the casualties. Even Commander Walker's Carondelet and the water batteries experience losses. A prominent Confederate gun captain is struck down by debris from a Union shell explosion, while a 128-pound Confederate projectile pierces the side of the gunboat, causing chaos as it ricochets and injures several sailors with splintered wood, ultimately damaging a steam heater before plunging into the water. The young crew members of the gunboat quickly realize that the ironclads do not guarantee safety from the perils of battle. Meanwhile, in the woods, the formidable Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is beginning to gain recognition as one of the war's most skilled and resilient cavalry officers, takes action. Frustrated by a persistent marksman from the renowned Burgess's Western sharpshooters, he borrows a Maynard rifle from one of his officers and successfully eliminates the shooter from his perch in a tree. This young sharpshooter would be the first of many Union soldiers to fall victim to the Forrest during the conflict. Additionally, artillery fire can be heard that morning in McLernan's sector as his troops attempt to maneuver around Dover via the wind ferries and Pyrenees roads. Illinois cavalrymen first observed the Cumberland River from Mount Dudley's Hill, quickly drawing fire from the Confederate fortifications and artillery in that area. One particularly troublesome battery, commanded by Captain Frank Manley from Humphrey County, bombards McLernan's advancing Federal troops with long-range artillery. In response to this provocation, General McLernan resolves to put an end to the harassment. Disregarding Grant's previous orders, he dispatches a brigade to charge through the debris-laden ravines toward the main Confederate stronghold in an effort to silence the troublesome guns. Colonel William R. Morrison's 3rd Brigade launches the assault under the direct command of Colonel Asham and Haney of the 48th Illinois, advancing from the Wind Ferry Road into Aaron Hollow and Parade Ground formation. The engagement concludes within 15 minutes. Similar to General Smith's earlier reconnaissance, the attack led by Haney and Morrison is severely hampered by accurate enemy fire and the disorganization of the attackers in challenging terrain. The result is devastating, with another 150 Federal soldiers falling near the battery's position. During the conflict, dry leaves ignite, posing a grave threat to the wounded. Once the firing ceases, compassionate Confederates emerge from their positions to assist their former adversaries. However, it is not long before both sides resume hostilities. Both factions anticipate an assault by the gunboats on Fort Donelson, as Grant is confident that his ally foot can achieve another significant victory, similar to that at Fort Henry. However, the flag officer hesitates due to the losses his flotilla incurred in the previous engagement. Consequently, Grant instructs Brigadier General Lew Wallace to transport reinforcements overland from the Tennessee River Post, organizing them into a 3rd Division to be stationed between Smith and McLernan. thereby securing the Indian Creek Valley area. Grant's forces are now nearing 21,000 troops encircling Dover as he anxiously awaits action from the gunboats. During the night, temperatures drop to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, with biting winds driving snow, sleet, and freezing rain against the soldiers positioned on both sides of the lines. The prohibition of fires is in place to prevent revealing their locations to the enemy. Many young Union volunteers regret hastily discarding their blankets and overcoats during the march from Fort Henry. In contrast, few units are as fortunate as Confederate Colonel Roger Hanson's 2nd Kentucky of Brigadier General Buckner's right wing, who are equipped with hooded parkas. Many of their Southern counterparts resort to wrapping themselves in old quilts and blankets, or even cutting up pieces of carpet to shield themselves from the harsh weather. One Union brigade commander reflected on the night, describing it as one of immense suffering and hardship. As a cold dawn breaks on Valentine's Day, February 14th, neither army is particularly prepared for combat. However, Grant rises early, eager for action. At approximately 9 a.m., he and his staff ride to the river to meet with Foote aboard his flagship. Grant instructs the newly arrived troops on the transport to leave their comfortable accommodations and join the cold soldiers surrounding Fort Donelson. He then convinces Foote that the gunboats could potentially bypass the water batteries and infiltrate the rebel positions, thereby compelling their surrender. Foote prefers to wait for the arrival of flatboats carrying heavy mortars to subdue the fort. Grant, however, insists that the army requires support and that it is time to complete their mission. The disgruntled flag officer gathers his boat captains, provides them with combat preparations, and then focuses on his battle strategy. They plan to proceed as they did at Fort Henry. Meanwhile, the Confederate gunners remain at their posts through the frigid night, anticipating an advance by the gunboats under the cover of a stormy darkness. At times, they discharge a shot down the river merely to irritate Foote's flotilla in the transport vessels. Early on St. Valentine's Day, Captain Reuben Ross, stationed at the upper battery, observes a significant plume of smoke, signaling that something is amiss. He promptly relays this information to Floyd's headquarters. However, the Confederate generals are preoccupied with other issues. Floyd communicates via telegram to General Johnston, asserting that he is now confronted by 40,000 Union troops and expresses his intention to engage them that evening. Indeed, Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner are planning a surprise maneuver to disrupt the land siege. Organizing the troops takes time, and just as they prepare for the breakout, the gunboats come into view on the river. At approximately 2 p.m. on February 14th, Flag Officer Foote's flotilla rounds a bend in the river, navigating against the strong current of the murky waters. It takes 30 minutes for them to approach the water batteries. Leading the charge are the City Series ironclads U.S. St. Louis, Louisville, Pittsburgh, and Carondelet, moving in formation as they did at Fort Henry. Following them are the timberclads USS Tyler and Conestoga, positioned about a quarter of a mile behind. In the meantime, Captain Ross fires several rounds at the Union transports, causing them to scatter after disembarking their troops. He then redirects his fire toward the gunboats, which have commenced their assault approximately 1.5 miles from the batteries. As the vessels close in to point-blank range, they endure severe damage from Ross and his powerful artillery. The Confederate gunners have meticulously calculated their ranges by marking trees along the riverbank and have created specialized sighting devices for their cannons. Floodwaters have already carried away a barrier of floating trees nearly 900 yards from the batteries. It is now the responsibility of the water batteries to secure victory independently. The naval engagement at Fort Donelson takes on a different character compared to that at Fort Henry, as Foote approaches to within 450 yards of the batteries shortly after mid-afternoon. These artillery positions are situated at a higher elevation than the rove guns at Fort Henry, and the plunging fire from the two water batteries at Fort Donelson quickly exposes the vulnerabilities of the gunboats. The vessels are subjected to a relentless barrage of cannon fire from both the front and rear. Before long, all the gunboats, except for the Carondelet, are retreating downstream in defeat. During the exchange of artillery fire, Flag Officer Foote sustains an ironic injury to his foot. His flagship, the USS St. Louis, has been severely damaged in the confrontation. Confederate soldiers, shivering along the perimeter of Fort Donelson, erupt in cries of victory. They had not anticipated overcoming the gunboats. At one point, An agitated Nathan Bedford Forrest implored an aide, Parson, to pray, asserting that only Almighty God could save the fort. The inexperienced Confederate artillerymen have achieved an impressive 50% accuracy rate against the gunboats. The embarrassed naval officer counts 54 casualties among his heavily damaged fleet. As another harsh winter night descends upon the beleaguered Union forces, they can hear the celebrations echoing from the Confederate lines. This marks the Confederacy's most significant victory at Fort Donelson, and Grant remains far from optimistic about the prospects for a swift resolution. While he allows the Navy to formulate its own justifications for the defeat, he writes to his wife, Julia, that evening, indicating that the capture of Fort Donelson is likely to be a prolonged endeavor. The moment of critical decision has arrived for the Confederacy in the West. News of the Confederate victory is transmitted via telegraph to Johnston, countering earlier forecasts of a devastating defeat at the hands of the formidable gunboats. Johnston responds to Floyd, advising that if the fort is lost, he should move his troops to Nashville if feasible. However, with victory seemingly within reach, the brigadiers hesitate regarding their next course of action. General Floyd calls a war council to deliberate whether to persist in the battle or attempt to escape the federal encirclement. Pillow advocates for remaining in position. Floyd and Buckner have opted to launch a surprise attack the following morning. The specifics of their plan remain unclear. Pillow is aware that once the escape route is available, the troops will return to the rifle pits to secure their baggage, artillery, rations, the water battery gunners, and other personnel. Conversely, Buckner believes that the attackers will continue their advance after breaching the Union lines, leaving no option for retreat. Consequently, gunners, supplies, and surplus troops would be abandoned, with the only certainty being the planned assault for the morning. Brigadier General Bushrod Johnston leaves the meeting feeling more despondent and anxious than he did prior. Just as Foot's arrival has disrupted Confederate strategies that afternoon, the unexpected success at the water batteries leaves Southern generals uncertain about whether to retreat or continue fighting. Regardless, the troops assemble for the significant Confederate offensive set for dawn on Saturday, February 15th. As they position themselves during the wintry night, the sounds of their movements are muted by snow and wind. The Federal forces remain unaware of the shifting formations. Buckner's men retreat from their fortifications, leaving behind a single regiment of 450 soldiers armed with shotguns to confront Smith's entire division. Delays are unavoidable. As fatigued soldiers navigate the slick roads, Buckner's forces are still not in place when Generals Pillow and Johnston initiate their attack at 6 a.m. on February 15th. McLernan's cold and drowsy troops emerge from their makeshift shelters as the first warning shots and the notorious rebel yell pierce the frigid morning air. The significant effort to escape starvation, Yankee prison camps, and the disgrace of surrender has commenced. General Pillow would later refer to this as the Battle of Dover. The snow, underbrush, and lack of tactical experience further hinder any swift resolution. The conflict escalates into a fierce confrontation between the Confederate assault columns and McLernan's sparse line of defenders near the Forge and Wind Ferry roads. By 8 a.m., the Federal forces find themselves in a precarious situation as the fighting spreads through the rural lanes and ravines, with bloodied snow marking the locations of engagement between the opposing lines. Forrest's cavalry successfully dislodges a determined Union field battery, while the Confederate infantry gradually pushes McLernan's 1st Division back under intense pressure. As the young Union soldiers deplete their ammunition, they begin to fall out of formation, raising their empty cartridge boxes and initiating a slow retreat. McLernan dispatches couriers to Lew Wallace's command post seeking assistance, but the Indiana general hesitates to act without directives from Grant, who has mysteriously vanished. Earlier that morning, Grant had once again traveled with the wounded aboard his gunboat, leaving his headquarters aides uncertain of how to proceed in his absence. The intervening woods obscure the sounds of the ongoing battle from the command meetings at the river. Consequently, by noon, Pillow and Johnson have brought the Confederate forces to the verge of victory. The Federal defeat is primarily attributed to exhaustion, supply shortages, and ineffective defensive strategies, rather than any deficiency in courage or determination. Nevertheless, McLernan's division has been pushed back from its position, and the attackers are unable to complete their mission. By early afternoon, the relentless advance of Pillow and Johnson, now bolstered by Buckner, has achieved their objective. The Federals have been forced back from the Forge Road and westward along the Winds Ferry Road towards Fort Henry. Two of McLernan's three frontline brigades have been severely weakened, and the third is retreating rapidly. Additionally, another brigade is overwhelmed as it rushes in from reserve. At that moment, the Confederates have an opportunity to escape the Fort Donelson trap. Positioned along a mile-long front, the soldiers are prepared, but their commanders are not. Over the next 2 hours, the Confederate generals relinquish the initiative back to their adversaries. A series of events transforms potential victory into defeat. General Wallace seizes the initiative and establishes a blocking position along Winds Ferry Road, effectively halting the Confederate advance. The rebel forces lose their momentum, prompting General Pillow to interpret the original plan and order a retreat to the trenches in preparation for evacuation. Pillow also observes indications of a Federal assault on Buckner's tenuously held position in the distance. However, Buckner strongly protests and challenges Pillow's authority to alter the plan. The two generals engage in a dispute while their troops remain in limbo, awaiting further instructions. At this juncture, Floyd intervenes between his two subordinates and ultimately commands all troops to return to the defensive perimeter. Just then, Grant arrives on the battlefield. After being located by anxious couriers, he has hastily traversed treacherous icy roads to address the impending crisis on his right flank. Upon conferring with Generals McLernan and Wallace, Grant recognizes the gravity of the situation. He realizes that his own career may be at stake. He observes McLernan's men clustered together, animatedly discussing matters without any officers providing guidance. Additionally, he notes that while the soldiers possess their muskets, they lack ammunition, despite it being readily available nearby. He instructs an aide to ride along the line and urgently calls out to the bewildered troops, urging them to quickly fill their cartridge boxes and form ranks. The enemy is attempting to escape, and they must not be allowed to do so. This command proves effective. Grant also learns from captured soldiers about the developments on the Confederate line, revealing that the seemingly victorious enemy may be just as demoralized as his own troops. The individual who takes the lead at this juncture is poised to secure victory. With determination, he bites down on an unlit cigar and instructs McLernan and Wallace, stating, "Gentlemen, we must reclaim the position on the right." He also communicates with Foote, requesting a display of strength from the gunboats. Grant's swift and resolute leadership galvanizes his troops into action, enabling them to stabilize their lines and push the Confederates back to their original defenses. The Confederates had a chance to escape, but that opportunity has now slipped away. The battle has resulted in nearly 1,000 casualties on both sides, with around 3,000 wounded still lying on the ground, some succumbing to the harsh snowstorm. At 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, the Confederate generals convene a war council at the Dover Hotel. During this meeting, they conclude that it is time to surrender both the fort and their forces. Brigadier General Floyd, fearing prosecution for corruption during his tenure as Secretary of War under President Buchanan, hastily transfers command to General Pillow. However, Pillow, also apprehensive about potential repercussions from the North if captured, hands over command of Fort Donelson to Buckner, who consents to stay behind and surrender the army. Disheartened by the general's display of cowardice, Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest declares, "I did not come here to surrender my command," and promptly exits the meeting. He then leads approximately 700 of his cavalrymen in an escape from the fort, embarking on a challenging march through the snowstorm toward Nashville. Colonel Forrest is determined to fight another day. Meanwhile, General Buckner sends a message to General Grant inquiring about the terms of surrender, hoping for leniency from Grant, who had previously assisted him in financial matters during their civilian lives before the war. The communication Grant sends indicates that he will only accept an unconditional and immediate surrender. He further states his intention to advance on the enemy's fortifications without delay. Buckner consents to Grant's terms of unconditional surrender. Consequently, Fort Donelson capitulates on February 16th, leading to the capture of his army, which is subsequently taken to northern prison camps. This significant victory at the Battle of Fort Donelson elevates Ulysses S. Grant to national prominence, earning him the moniker Unconditional Surrender Grant and attracting the attention of President Lincoln. Approximately one-third of General Johnston's forces are now in captivity. Grant's success in capturing more soldiers than all previous American generals combined results in Johnston losing over 12,000 troops, which he would require for future engagements. Following this decisive triumph at Fort Donelson, President Lincoln promotes Grant to the rank of Major General and assigns him command of the newly established Army of the Tennessee. With the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson, Grant is now positioned to initiate an invasion further south along the Tennessee River. Thank you for your attention.